librarians. Welcome to episode 223 of School Librarians United. I am your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian, wrapping up my 16th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast has something for you. Friends, the mailbag will have to wait until next week. I am recording a little early this week in advance of some fun news, which I'll be sharing later this month. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook. On Twitter, my handle is @LMS_United, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. And now a word from our official sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo research database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children, and I am so excited to be working with them. I am grateful that Capstone has continued their commitment to support the podcast in Season 5. They are offering listeners of School Librarians United a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. And now for our episode, First Chapter Fridays, and my conversation with Kim Palmer. Kim Palmer, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Kim, would you let us know, this is your first time on the show, would you let us know where in the country you work, tell us about your current library, what grades you support, a little bit about your teaching schedule, because I know we're going to be talking about your programs today.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. So I'm a high school library media specialist in New Hampshire. I live and work in the same town, and I've been working there for 20 years. The school is a high school made up of 9th through 12th graders. We also have students that come from a different town. We also have a career technical program. So students from local schools can come to our school to take programs like biotech and culinary arts. My library has a flexible schedule. So classes can come into the library, or I can go into classes as we schedule them at the convenience of teacher projects, papers, etc. And students can come into the library with a pass from their teacher or during their off blocks. And I also support 4 study halls a day.
Wow. It's a lot going on. Can I ask, do you have an assistant?
I do. I have a wonderful assistant. We've been working together for 20 years. So
oh my gosh.
I am so fortunate.
Wow. Now, forgive me, how many years of those 20 have you been the school librarian?
20.
Really?
Yep.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, every once in a while I'll record with somebody and they'll be like 1. And we're like, no. Like, how many years have you been a school librarian? And in the same school? That's amazing.
In the same school, and I also went to high school there. So I've been in that building a long time.
I was going to say, you probably know it pretty well.
So as far as extracurricular activities after school, I work with the kids. I'm the book club advisor. I am one of the junior prom advisors, and that prom was just on Friday, so I'm happy that is behind me. I am a helping staff member for the Sexuality and Gender Equity Club and a member of the School Wellness Committee.
Wow. So let me ask you, the SAGE group, is that a new name for your GSA?
Yes, it is. They renamed themselves, I believe, last school year.
Okay. Now, I just have to, ask, do you feel that it has changed at all the climate of the group? I mean, you were there last year, you're there this year. Was that something that was initiated by the kids or something that the advisors did?
Nope, it was absolutely initiated by the students. If I would say there's one thing that's a little bit different this year than last year is this year they spent a lot of time creating a program to educate teachers on LGBTQ issues in the schools.
Oh, wow.
So that was a big success for them.
Okay, now I just have to ask, what did your SAGE group do to educate the educators in your building?
On a professional development day, they had a workshop where they focused a lot about language, definitions, pronouns, and how they just can help the kids in school.
And this was student-led?
Students, yes. Yes, or, the advisors, helped out and facilitated, but they were the ones creating the program.
Oh, I love that. I think that makes it even more meaningful than, say, bringing in some of the outside group.
Well, it's interesting you said that because we wanted to do that, but that group was not able to come for safety reasons.
Got it. Oh, but again, I think this was a better outcome.
It is.
So much more meaningful. And I think coming from the students, I think you have a far more likely chance that your audience, your staff members, are going to be receptive to the message that the students are providing rather than random strangers showing up. I'm going to use an example. Our building brought in the Anti-Defamation League to do some training. Excellent training, but they really were just strangers addressing us. And so you have to work on building some of those connections because they were just presenters that we brought in from the outside.
Yeah, the students did a great job.
Before we got recording, apparently it's your birthday. Happy birthday.
It is. Thank you so much. The big 50 today.
Well, I do think that's a podcast first, and it shows true dedication to your craft. I really do appreciate you taking out some time on your birthday to record this episode. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
It will make it memorable for everybody. This is, hey, what did you do on your birthday? Oh, I recorded a podcast.
Check it off my bucket list.
I love that. Well, and if it makes you feel any better, well, friends, I will always be older than you. I'm really sorry I didn't get a chance to meet you in March while I was in New Hampshire, but I'm thrilled that you reached out to the podcast with your idea for an episode. Before we go any further, I'm hoping that you can dispel a misconception that I know I've been holding on to for a long time. First Chapter Fridays happen on Fridays. And I'm learning that just isn't the case.
Of course not. I've learned about First Chapter Fridays through the Spark Creativity blog and podcast by Betsy Potash. I follow her on all social media, and many of our English department teachers also follow her as well. And they have creative assignments that can be seen in our English hallways in our school based on some of her ideas. And so basically, whatever day falls in your schedule of the librarian or whoever is reading the First Chapter Friday book, it's fine. It is such a flexible program. So there's some examples of other days. You could say, meet a book Mondays, or book trailer Tuesdays, or Thursdays, or read Wednesdays are just some other ideas. It really doesn't matter.
All right. So I get tripped up on that because I was like, First Chapter Fridays, but I'm on when I was an elementary teacher, I was on a 4-day rotation. That was a mess.
Oh, yeah.
And as somebody who works with students now on a flexible schedule, kids come in when kids come in. It's not necessarily going to be a Friday.
That's right.
All right, so thank you very much, because now we can create an opportunity to talk about first chapters any day of the week. I'm looking at these fantastic resources you've shared with listeners in the show notes. I'd like to know what motivated the First Chapter Friday initiative on your part, because it would seem to me like you've come to the rescue of the ELA team in your school.
So I listened to the podcast and I was so interested. I said, okay, this is something I want to do. So I went to my English department and talked to the English department lead and told her that I was interested in maybe trying this out. So she invited me to an English department meeting where we talked about it, and we decided to come up with a literacy goal. So by June of 2022, students will have increased their engagement with choice text and/or independent reading by participating in First Chapter Fridays, a cooperative initiative of the English department and the MHS Library Media Center.
Now, I'm just going to ask because right now we're at a point in the year where so many of our goal statements have to be quantified with data. Were you required to produce data to support this goal at the end of that year?
Well, one of our English teachers used it as his SLO. So we worked together to do that. We came up with a Google form at the end of the semester where 40 of his students filled out the form. And so we had some data from that.
Nice. Well, and my experience has been that my SLO is oftentimes tied to what happens actually in the classroom. And I am sort of connected through lessons that I've taught, but ultimately the end result might happen after my lesson has concluded and they're working on the finished product. So that sounds like it works the same way in your school.
Mm-hmm.
All right, wonderful.
Yeah, it was a good collaboration.
Oh, and that's always, anytime we collaborate with teachers, it is a win. But boy, when we can tie in with those student learning objectives, those are all too often sort of hanging over the heads of all educators. And anytime you are working on this goal with another person, it's got to feel like you've got sort of an ally in the process. I know that I rely on certain teachers. I can reach out to them and say, hey, you want to work on your SLO together? Because I do too. And it really does help alleviate some of that stress of reaching those goals by yourself.
Absolutely. Every year I actually reach out to a teacher or a department where I could do my SLO with them.
So it hasn't always been the ELA department?
No, science department also.
Okay. Do tell me, what was the SLO? What was the objective? What was the goal that you were working on with the science department? Can you give us just an idea of what you were doing with them that satisfied that requirement?
One of them was in regard to Genius Hour. So helping them with their research on Genius Hour projects. And another year, it was working with citations for a specific science project.
Wonderful. All right. See, it's important because I think too often, especially for me, I always fall back on the people I see the most, and those happen to be the English teachers.
Yeah.
But it is that goal. Every once in a while, I work with the business department, and I just feel like it's such a win. I'm like, yes. Or the PE teachers, because they all teach health, and I'm like, I teach research.
That's
right. And they're like, really? I'm like, yep, absolutely. So given that this goal is one which supports all the readers in the school, can you give us an idea of the timeline? And I appreciate that for many of us in the United States, our year is wrapping up. What advice would you give to someone who's looking to initiate a First Chapter Friday version of that in their school?
I think that this is such an easy initiative to get started with very minimal effort. Teachers can look to their classroom libraries, speak to their school librarians, and grab a few books that students are currently checking out or reading in their classroom, maybe a past popular choice from a year or two ago. Also, there's so many resources out there online on already curated lists of First Chapter Friday books that are available online, and I've also provided one. Another time saver is that you don't have to really read the whole book ahead of time. So grab a few books, read some of the first chapters, look at the book reviews. You know the genre. You can dive a little deeper online to maybe find out the major themes. Look at Goodreads and get a feel for the book. And then you can get started. Another option is there are videos of authors reading the book that you could use as a starting point if you yourself didn't want to start reading or the librarian didn't have time to start reading.
You know, something that I've realized, and this is true whether our students are littles or they're in the middle school. I've taught elementary for a long time, and I found that oftentimes when I was book talking, I was book talking the books they didn't know about. There were certain books I never had to, promote because the kids wanted to read them because those were the ones that were flying off the shelves. My task was really more to be promoting books that I knew were good and that for some reason the students hadn't discovered these books yet. And so my job was to promote books that these were titles that I loved and I had read and I knew, and maybe I had seen kids reading them in another school that I worked in. I thought, you know what, I've got a bunch of these copies, especially if I had multiple copies, because then if I was reading it, all of a sudden I'm like, and I have 3 copies right now,
Yes, and I don't necessarily have 3 copies in my library, but that's okay because our English department, almost every classroom has a classroom library in it. So I could go to another teacher and ask if they have a copy. And I also have a very strong relationship with our town library. So anytime I need multiple copies of a book, I just reach out to our town library and get the books from there.
Now, forgive me, does your library deliver to your library? I mean, would your public library run those books over, or is that something that you're going to be stopping off after school and picking up the books?
It.
Absolutely.
And return them.
Yes.
It's part of my customer service.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and building that relationship with the public librarians is one I'm sure you've had years to develop because you've worked in the same school. I know for me, this is my second year. I'm really grateful that I can lean on them. Every once in a while, they send me extra copies of things, which maybe they were, maybe at one point they had 10 copies of something and then they were bringing it down to like 2 copies and like, we've got extra copies. I'm like, I'll take it.
Yeah, they help me too with graphic novels. Gives me a way to build up my graphic novel collection as a public library.
Well, and I will say when I worked in the elementary school, we still supported having print encyclopedias, like a set, so that we could teach it. A couple of the teachers wanted to have like the kids look at an encyclopedia article and it was, I never had to buy a set because the public library was always getting rid of a set and it was every 5 years. And I'm like, oh, we'll take a set.
Absolutely.
When you're looking to schedule these first chapter Fridays, obviously there's going to be some planning that goes into it on your end and on the teacher's end. Do they communicate that to you in advance or through emails, or do they have a way to schedule that time with you?
Yes, there are several ways. One way is they can just go on our Google Calendar and sign up. But usually I see them often enough in the hallway or just in general to schedule it. At the beginning of this semester, I knew that one teacher in particular wanted to have this on the regular schedule. So I know 2 blocks a day on Friday, I will be going into their classroom so I can be prepared. Other times, though, sometimes a teacher might know that they're going to be out for a day or the school day schedule is off, maybe because of testing or something else, and I can just jump into that classroom and I already have pre-done books and I can just go in there with minimal preparation.
So our class periods tend to run about 57 minutes long. The expectation then, though, is when you do like a first chapter Friday, whether that takes place on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, or actually on a Friday, are you expecting to take up like a quarter of that class period or half of that class period? Is that explained, or do you have any sort of exchange? Like, I'm trying to figure out how that would work with my teachers. Like, how do you know how much time you think you're going to take?
I personally generally take about a half an hour because first I introduce the book. I have a Google slide up on the board with some information on it. I show them the book cover. I give them a little description of the book. I do a little short book talk. I might open the cover, read what's in the cover, kind of modeling, okay, here's a book. Sometimes I'll ask them a question, what do you think this book is about? What genre, based on the book cover, do you think this book is about? And then I always discuss the genre of the book and why it's that genre, and maybe some of the main characters, some of the major themes. And then when we're all settled, I have a seat, and then I just start reading for, say, maybe 20 minutes or so. And I usually just find a good stopping point. I oftentimes go beyond one chapter, though.
Oh.
Yeah, sometimes I can even get up to 3 chapters. It just depends on how short the chapters are.
Okay.
And then when I look up,
wow.
It's very flexible. You do whatever you want.
Wow.
However much time the teacher needs.
Well, and yeah, sometimes I can appreciate, I've had some teachers come to me and say, so I'm not going to be at school tomorrow, and I have a sub. Can they come down to the Learning Commons with the sub? They're going to have a sub, but would you mind? And then they say, insert, what lesson would they like to have? Or, can you do a checkout for my students while I'm not here? And, depending on how comfortable the classroom teacher is, especially with that particular class, sometimes teachers are like, no, we're not coming down because of that particular class.
Yeah.
But so, let me ask you, as a former elementary librarian for 14 years, let me just say that First Chapter Fridays aren't a new idea, but providing this program to our oldest and theoretically our most capable readers seems on the surface like hand-holding. So as a high school teacher, now this is your 20 years and you've been a high school librarian for 20 years, how is it that you can justify reading to kids who can presumably read the book themselves?
Well, high school students are not read to often. I'm sure in some English classes they're reading their novel text or maybe some nonfiction text aloud to them. And certainly mostly in other classes and at home they're not being read to. But listening is such an important skill to have. According to studies, listening to audiobooks is very effective in developing comprehension skills. It also helps students who are auditory learners, who learn best by listening. And it can help students who struggle with decoding texts and helps with vocabulary. I personally love listening to audiobooks. That's my favorite way to read now. And it brings joy to the classroom. I mean, listening to a book is joyful. They can relax. They can have a break. It gives me an opportunity to positively interact with the students without any kind of grading component. And according to Kids Read Now, reading a story creates space for students to imagine themselves inside a story. This allows them to develop empathy as they experience the lives of other characters and can identify with how they are feeling. So there is a social emotional aspect to reading aloud to students, which is very important to me. The SEL curriculum is important to me.
Well, and I realize I make a huge assumption, and I sort of wanted to take it back as soon as I said it, and that was this idea that our high school students can all read. And I think that, especially now working at the high school level, I'm acutely aware that there are indeed some students whose ability to read is not nearly what many of their peers happen to be. And in some cases, you have students who are English language learners. In other cases, you have students who are working on accommodations. And, it is not, one shouldn't presume that just because you're in high school that you can obviously pick up any book that we happen to have and just start reading.
That's right.
So no, I think that's a huge sort of mistake on my part to make that sort of assumption. I think, and forgive me, but in my limited experience, this is only my second year working with high school students, because I've not had a great deal of opportunity to build up a lot of culture of reading in a space which really didn't have it before I moved in. When I moved in, I was charged with building a reading culture because it was not there for years leading into when I was hired. But forgive me, when I watch my students check out books that they are checking out for independent reading, their teacher says, hey, we're going to do an assignment, go pick out a book. Then the teacher says the book has to be at least 150 pages long. And I think First Chapter Friday would alleviate some of this, because my students walk in and I say, hey, can I help you out? I'm going to, let me help you check out some books. And they're like, no. I know what I'm looking for. And they all come back with books roughly 152 pages long, or maybe 153 pages long. And they don't care what the book's about.
Yeah.
But it's the page number which is driving their choices. And I'm thinking, this is why I need First Chapter Friday in my life.
Yes. And a conversation about how, page numbers are not that important. And depending on the text in the book, or whether there's images in the book. And I don't know. I think learning about the genres is so important, because I find that high school students, especially those who don't read often, or say they just don't read, it's really hard for them to just take a look at all these covers and be like, I don't know. So having that conversation with students with what they're interested in, maybe what kind of movies do they watch? Are they involved in sports or other activities? Do they want, something with a lot of action?
I do think this is something that over time, and obviously I need to get better at selling the collection I currently have, but also very excited about building out the collection, because that hasn't happened in years. So bringing in bringing in the books that they might be seeing on TikTok, bringing in the books that they might be seeing, that they watch, they've been made into the movie adaptations. Well, get the books then, and then they can read the books that they've seen the movies of. And I know that there are ways to do this, but it is a process that clearly happens over years. And a program like First Chapter Friday would at least give some of that foundation to students to recognize, this isn't about finding a book that's 150 pages long. This is about finding a book that you're legitimately interested in. And then in order to get that, to value that storyline, First Chapter Friday is something that's going to go a long ways towards giving that exposure, at least, to say this is what these books are about, and maybe they might look past the fact that it's over 150 pages.
And I feel like First Chapter Friday has also given me more confidence just to read to students in general before I might pass them a book that I think might match what they'd like to read. And then just say, here, read the front cover. Well, they just kind of look at it. Now, I might take a book, stand next to them. If I can't book talk it based on my prior knowledge, then I will just read the cover for them. And I'll say, does any of that interest you? If they say yes or no, I say why, and then we can move on from there.
I love that when you were talking about some of the introductory process that you when you introduced this book, that you did ask the students to guess what they thought the book was about. Because I think that all of us are guilty of making certain assumptions about what we see on a book. And then it's really interesting because every once in a while we're incredibly wrong in some of those assumptions. And yes, reading the blurb would fix that. reading the inside cover. But I do love the fact that you have the kids try to articulate, try to say out loud what they think the book is about.
Yeah, I like doing that, as well as while they are listening, if they choose. Some teachers prefer them to do it, but others, it doesn't matter. I ask them to take out a notebook, relax, doodle, sketch note. What are you feeling? What are you, when you're listening to this? Maybe draw a character, or what is the scene of the book? If it's dystopian, what kind of world is it like?
I think it would be interesting to see what they would write down, because as they're listening to you, it frees them up because they're not reading, they're listening. And so they can take the book in and start to, I want to say, ingest it. They're starting to really listen to it and appreciate the book for what it is, because they aren't doing the work of turning the pages. You're doing the work of reading it. And so it frees them up to be able to decide for themselves what they feel about this book. But it is interesting, because I know that I definitely have students who would rather sit and have something in front of them that they could draw on, to be able to sort of relax while somebody's reading to them. I'm going to ask this because I know listeners are hoping I ask this next question. Your high schoolers are likely to have phones on them, earbuds or AirPods, headphones around their necks. What success have you had in monitoring their behavior if you are also the one doing the reading?
Honestly, that really has not been an issue for me, because before I come in, the teacher usually sets the stage. Like, they know in advance I'm coming, they know what the expectations are, and that this is just, more of a relaxing experience. It's not a graded experience. And if I do see that, as I'm sitting down and going to get started to read, I just politely say, could you put your Chromebooks away now? Take your earbuds out if you want to take out your notebook, or take your, sketch note paper. Feel free to do that, but it really hasn't been an issue.
Well, and in terms of the sketch noting, is this sort of free form, or has any of that been modeled for them ahead of time?
I know that certain English teachers have modeled that. I personally have not modeled that for them, but they're given a sheet that they have an option to use. But I know some of our teachers have used it.
Okay. You've included First Chapter Friday videos in our show notes. And I'm kind of curious, because I know that this was a touchy subject during the pandemic. Can we post that first chapter read aloud without violating copyright?
So when you're in class and you show a video with an author reading their own book, or from a publisher's site of somebody reading the book, I feel like that is fair use and fine. Otherwise, reading a chapter of a book that's currently copyrighted, I believe that is a violation. However, in reality, you're in context with the kids. I personally wouldn't publish anything that I read without author's permission, but you're also promoting their book. But no, I would not do that without permission.
During the pandemic, I think that there were some publishing houses which put out if you wanted to read this book on a closed platform, one that was closed. And you're right. I mean, if it's especially if it's done through the publisher and the author's reading their own work, that's clearly not an issue or a violation of copyright. But I know that I've heard that in some cases, when you're doing one school, one book, that schools have wanted to post the chapters being read by staff members. And librarians have had the unenviable task of sort of stepping in and saying, actually, that's a violation of copyright, because what you've done is replace the need to even have the book.
Yeah, right. That I believe you would need to get permission for before doing that. Absolutely. if you didn't want to use a video, if you yourself or a guest speaker was unable to read to the class in person, many schools might have an audiobook collection. Our school is lucky that we have a subscription to the Sora app, where if a book is available on the platform, you could listen to the first couple chapters read from the audiobook version.
I've done that a couple times with the audiobooks, which are a full cast. And I think that that's fun because to me, when a book is when it's a full cast read, I love that. So I think, friends, if you go and look at the audiobooks which have won Odyssey Awards, the Odyssey Awards are for outstanding audio production of an audiobook. And one of them was Daisy Jones and the Six.
Ooh.
And of course,
that's on my TBR.
Yeah. So Daisy Jones and the Six has now been made into, I believe, is it Netflix? I'm not quite sure. It's now streaming, and it's been made into a movie. But the audiobook is a full cast.
Wow.
And it's fantastic. And especially when you've got chapters which alternate voices, and they've got different cast members reading different chapters. To me, that really changes the listening experience altogether.
And sometimes audiobooks will have sound effects as well. So you really feel like you're almost listening to a movie almost.
Absolutely. So, how do you decide, and we talked about this a little bit, but how do you decide which books are part of your First Chapter Friday? You've offered a list. I'm guilty of pulling titles that I know are fantastic and my kids are maybe not aware of, but how do you decide what books you are going to pull when you're either going to the classroom or you have students coming into the library?
Yeah, I have many strategies for that. Sometimes I'll just go look on an already curated list and grab some off the shelf. Honestly, oftentimes I'll just grab some books that I know are appealing to students, or they've checked them out recently or had good reviews, or maybe on a award winner list. And then I'll bring them home and I'll just maybe read the first chapter. Or sometimes it's a book club book and I'll say, yep, nope. I also try to appeal. I'm also looking for different genres. I find that I know that students have been really interested in mysteries and dystopian books. Those are usually pretty easy, to find and are usually easy with First Chapter Fridays. But I want to expose them to all the different genres. So I need to look for historical fiction, maybe take a biography, a romance, fantasy. Now, fantasy is a little bit of a problem for me because, one, that is not my favorite genre. And thankfully, one of the English teacher, it is her. So that's my backup. For two, I feel like there's a lot of world building or difficult names. And I find within the first couple chapters, you haven't gotten there yet.
Well, and I think you've hit upon something that's very well known to anybody who has invested in fantasy as a genre that they really enjoy. And as somebody who, for me, it certainly isn't one that I glom onto really quickly. You're right, because in fantasy, all too often, there's that world building, which takes a lot of time and investment on the part of the reader. And it's entirely possible you could get through that first chapter and everybody's confused.
Right.
Everybody's confused.
Nobody knows quite what's going on yet.
No, but you look at a book that's more thriller or suspense, and all of a sudden, usually in the first 3 sentences, somebody's dead.
Right.
And and all of a sudden you're like, okay. Or sometimes it's just you haven't even opened the book. You look at the cover and you're like, okay, definitely somebody dies. And it happens on the first page.
There have been times too of books that I have definitely read in full that maybe the first couple chapters aren't the most interesting, but I know of a good spot. So I'll tell them I'm starting at chapter 4, but this is the lead up. And then I'll read a couple chapters.
Oh, that's a good workaround. So I know that, some of us really like to build displays around the programs that we have or designate how would students find these books if you have, obviously you've been doing First Chapter Fridays consistently for quite some time. How do you designate which books you've done as First Chapter Fridays? Do you have a sort of a pullout or a space where they are showcased? But as a reader coming into your library, is there an opportunity for me to see them sort of situated in a space together, or do they have a designation on them so I could look for them?
Not formally yet, but I absolutely love this idea. So I'm thinking now, because we do put genre stickers on our books, that I can make one up for First Chapter Friday and put them on the ones I have already done. I do usually have it out on display, whether it's just like on an end cap anyway, because I've recently read them and I want them to be, easy to find, but I haven't had a formal process of displaying them, but I think now I might.
Well, and I think that, a bookmark.
Yes, a bookmark is a great idea as well.
You would do a bookmark. I've heard of some librarians, when students have read a book that they would like to talk about, that they might create like a QR code with a flip. A student might create instead of doing like a little index card that they do at bookstores about somebody who recommends a book, you could do like a little QR with a student having made a little flip video and one that the students could then watch and say, oh, this is recommended by my friend, and I'm going to watch this little video on why they enjoyed it. This initiative started as a goal that you shared in supporting your ELA team and literacy in your school. Can you share with us what were some of the outcomes of this effort?
Sure. So I started with one of the English teachers who wanted to do this for his SLO. And at the end of the semester, we provided a survey to the students. We received about 40 results. 38 of those students enjoyed the First Chapter Friday program. 33 were at least interested in one of the books I've read. And 4 students actually checked out one of the books I read over the semester. But my favorite part of this were some of the comments that I'm going to read to you. After listening to Books on Friday, do you feel more confident in choosing books for independent reading? Most students chose maybe, some yes, some no's, but mostly maybes. But some student comments included, I feel like this should be a thing every Friday. It's relaxing and it's really quite nice to sit down and listen to. Another student comment said, you should do more fantasy books. Most of the books were realistic books, in my opinion, and it would be more interesting if we did more fantasy books. Another student said, having us tell you the favorite part of the book that the teacher read to us all. So I think they're saying maybe have a little discussion afterwards. I would just make sure that you are offering all different genres from reading First Chapter Fridays. But besides that, I found them informative when choosing a book. So that was really good feedback on my first time around. I realized I need to bring in fantasy. I need to, not just pick mystery.
Can I ask, are you at all interested in introducing nonfiction?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
I definitely would.
You would do nonfiction.
Yeah,
okay.
I've done a biography.
Well, and we do memoirs in our school. We do a lot of memoirs because our 11th grade does a memoir unit. But I just know that there are a lot of books that are nonfiction, narrative, narrative nonfiction. I'm thinking about the author, and again, I'm new to high school, but high school nonfiction, Mary Roach. And I know that a lot of librarians love all her books. One of my recent guests mentioned Packing for Mars, but there's also Stiff and Grunt and 6 Feet Over. There's Bonk.
Yeah, Mary Roach.
Yes, there is Gulp. and yeah, so again, and there's Fuzz. That's the one I just placed on my book order, was Fuzz.
Is there Spooked? I think there's one maybe about ghost history. Gulp. I just got that in our collection as well.
It's fun, especially for readers like me. I love nonfiction, so for me, I really love to sort of do those deep dives, and it certainly taps a different part of the brain. And so, yes, Mary Roach is one that I think I'm. If I was going to do my first chapter Friday and start to introduce some nonfiction, that she'd probably be my first go-to.
Yeah, that is a great idea. But also, this is why First Chapter Friday is so flexible. There's not that many rules. There's no rules.
I'm figuring that out. Kim, I'm wondering, how has First Chapter Friday evolved over the years? Because you've done it now for a while. And do you keep track of which grade level hears which chapters?
So currently, I do not formally keep track of which grades are listening to which books. But I do keep all of my Google Slides that I use in the classes. However, moving forward, I think it'd be a good idea for me to add a note on the slide, like which graduating class, maybe which teacher. And yeah, because if I read a book to a freshman class and then next year I'm going into a sophomore class and I pick the same book, wow, that's a fail. However, sometimes another thing I have done is come in with a couple of books and given them the choice. I have this book and I have this book. And I usually, so there's so many things, but that is a great idea. Identifying my books, First Chapter Friday books, and keeping track.
As someone who has provided First Chapter Fridays for a while now, what advice would you give to listeners who are hoping to replicate the success in their buildings?
Connect with your English and reading teachers every semester. Anytime you can talk and collaborate with your teachers, that is the best. Because this is an activity that could be a regular activity, or it could just be at their convenience, or it could be once a month. It doesn't matter. It's so flexible, but it gives you an opportunity as a librarian or an assistant librarian to come into the classroom and read and connect with the kids. Also, if you had the time and space, you could ask and coordinate other teachers to go into classrooms. So maybe the art teacher comes in and reads a first chapter of a book, or maybe the school resource officer or one of the administrators or a community member.
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that.
Yeah, but I love to do it as a librarian.
Yeah, I think something that's been fun is recently when a book order comes in, I want to give the teachers that first, that first dibs on the books that come in, and they're getting ready and I'm processing them. They're like, oh, can I take this book back to my classroom? I'm like, absolutely. And so it's not unusual in those cases when the books first come in that I make an announcement that the books are in the office or in the workroom. And in some cases, I've been checking them out to the teachers, and the teachers are the ones who've been doing that first chapter with their students.
Yeah.
And so that's been really fun because they, our teachers have, and some of them have some small libraries in their classroom libraries. But when our new books come in, all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, I want to read this book. Can I take it back to my classroom? I'm like, absolutely. And I do check it out with the teacher. But it definitely has been fun to see them get excited about the books that just arrived. Kim, I'm so grateful. Would you, you've given us so many resources in our show notes. Would you give us an idea how we can follow you on social media?
You can follow me on Instagram at MHSATC Library.
Awesome. Friends, I will make sure to put Kim's social media in the show notes. And Kim, thank you so much. I'm grateful that we were able to reconnect after the conference in New Hampshire. And I know the end of your school year is coming up. It's May tomorrow.
It is. It's so exciting. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thanks, Kim. Friends, I'm always aware that when my guests arrange to meet with me and we share this conversation, that I'm keeping them from something that they would also like to be doing, whether it is relaxing, whether it is catching up on the next week that's coming up, or I don't know, celebrating their birthday. So Kim, happy birthday again. I felt terrible that I was taking you away from whatever it is you wanted to do on your special day, but I am so grateful that you decided to join us for this conversation. Thank you again, Kim Palmer. Friends, if you found this episode helpful, please share it out there to your PLN and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. One last friendly reminder, friends, I encourage you to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more using the code UNITED. The topic of our next episode will be content warnings and my conversation with Amanda Hunt. I hope you will tune in.